people come in important,
Yeah.
different.
Michael Paley.
The guy who, the rabbi from Argentina, Marshall Mayer, the Cowens, Rachel Cowens, who converted to Judaism, became a rabbi. Also Paul Cowens, her husband. Arthur Hertzberg, the rabbi, the famous conservative rabbi, Julius Lester, the civil rights, converted to Judaism. Those type of people.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
So, can I just interrupt just to
Sure,
have you
go
say on the screen your name?
David Kanell.
Thank you. And we're in your home.
Yeah.
In Waterford.
Waterford, Vermont.
Yeah,
Right.
Great. And this is March 30th.
Right.
2019. And I'm Erica Hurwitz Andrus. So that's for the record.
Okay.
Thank you. So I just want to hear any stories you have to tell me that you're...
Yeah, I don't know if there's a format of, where do you start and where do you end,
Well,
do you want it to more or less be about Vermont or?
yeah.
Yes.
So,
Okay.
if you were born here.
So basically, I'll tell it in, I think, a couple stages. I was a student at Linden State College from 1971 to 1974 and graduated in 1974. And my interactions with the local synagogue were mostly around the holidays. And they were mostly, being a participant at the holiday service. And it was held above a store on Railroad Street in St. Johnsbury called Love's Department Store. They rented, there was essentially, I think, if I remember right, 3 rooms. They were huge. It was a huge, one of the rooms was really huge. And then the synagogue itself up there was kind of smaller. And a long, steep flight of stairs going up to this second floor. And so as a student, coming from an urban area, going up to the second floor of a building with a department store underneath, left me with quite an impression.
Yeah.
I thought I was in another world. So I get up to the service, and there's this guy davening. They had mostly student rabbis from Hebrew Union College in New York. But there was a guy from Lindenville called Meshi Nuremberg, and he was less than 5 feet tall, and he was davening in the fastest Hebrew that one could ever imagine. That was just like the synagogue where I grew up in New Haven, and it was just, what am I doing here? This is like so I went a few times as a student. Then I came back in 1977 to go to work at Linden State College, and I became more involved with the synagogue. And of course, at that time, the synagogue had, I would say, very few members, maybe under 15 or 20, 15 or 20 single and family members. It was organized, but in a very loose way. They were all pretty friendly with each other. A lot of the people were businessmen. There was a couple doctors, some educators, and so eventually, eventually, anybody who attends the synagogue there right away, they want to put you on a committee or they want you to do something or whatever. So I was roped in pretty early on. And then, while I was young, I was in my early 20s at the time. And they had a crisis because someone bought the building that they were in. And after all these years, they were going to be, the guy who bought the building did not want them there. He had other designs. And so there was a time of really somewhat of a crisis because the community had to decide to where are we going to go, and so they were looking around to see just whether they should build a building or whether they should move somewhere else, and they looked around, but so in the meantime, the priest from the Catholic Church was very kind and generous and gave the synagogue 3 rooms in a school building that they controlled in town to use for a period of time. And so that became the synagogue. And believe me, it was like going from one place up on a second floor to a church building, to a Catholic church building. So the community had to make some decisions, and they decided eventually, after a lot of wrangling, because to buy a building they decided to build a building on Hospital Hill in St. Johnsbury. And then they had to raise some money, and so they eventually put up a building, and the one facet of the building wasn't big, it wasn't huge. It was basically, you can seat about 140 people, 135 people. And downstairs was a kitchen, a classroom, a rabbi study, and a big, a larger eating area type of thing. Kitchen, yeah. What would you call it?
An event room.
Event room. So nothing grand, nothing spectacular, nothing on the level of what they would have in Burlington or any other city, but it's what they could afford at that particular time. And so they raised some money. I think near 100,000, 80,000, 100,000. And a couple people gave, anonymous contributions, was very nice. And so we had the building built, and some of the members actually did some of the interior work on the building, like putting up the insulation and things like that, doing some carpentry work and other types of things. And then some donations came in here and there. One of the families bought the bima and, had the ark made and, those type of things. And so the communities at that particular time, had increased a few members. And we were drawing members from New Hampshire, Quebec, because the synagogue in Sherbrooke had closed down, so we were getting members from Sherbrooke to come down during the holidays mostly. And we were getting members from Newport, Vermont, which is about 40 miles from here, and also in Quebec, Stansted, there was a couple families, 2 or 3 families. And one of the families in Stansted became, pretty important over the years, and members, and they taught Hebrew school, and
Shared the presidency.
one was co-president, and also the male of the couple created a spectacular artwork on the back of the synagogue wall, the Western Wall. He's a noted artist. And so there's, people really chipped in here and there and mostly did what they could. And, and the people who, from Stansted, I will say, never took a nickel for teaching Hebrew school. It was all under their own resources that they came down. And that's a hefty, during the winter months.
You can name them, right?
Yeah, Chick and Marcia Schwartz. And they had 4 boys. And, at least 2 of their boys went to the Hebrew school because I think the other 2 were already bar mitzvah.
One of the things I like when you talk about the growth of the synagogue, you talk about how it had to be open to all kinds of Jews.
Yeah, and when I came here, I fully realized that we had Jewish folks from the Reform movement, from the Conservative movement, from the Orthodox movement, Orthodox leaning. And so basically, the way that it really needed to be done was to play it down the middle. Mm-hmm. And so we wanted to try to keep everybody happy. And we didn't want to go in one direction or the other direction. And we did see some synagogues, a couple synagogues in Vermont. They went either one way or another, and it led to some disharmony in the community.
You were having services Friday nights, right?
Yeah, they were having services, Friday night. And
every Friday night.
Every Friday night, and they did it at 7:30, which was late. And the reason they did it at 7:30 because there used to be some Jewish businessmen who would close their businesses at 7:00 on Friday night and then cross the street and come to services. This is when they were downtown. So that's...
How many bar and not bat mitzvahs at first, right? Just bar mitzvahs?
Well, I don't remember a time when there was both.
Okay.
So
would you say there wasn't 4 or 5 a year?
Yeah, there wasn't, in the beginning there wasn't a lot. Later on, at some point in time, we were getting student rabbis from Hebrew Union College. And I would say we were getting from the middle to the top echelon of students. And then at some point, the level of students that we were getting diminished. So at the last student rabbi we had, it was a pretty exasperating experience for the community. The person really wasn't prepared, and there was a lack of leadership and all this sort of thing. And just about the same period of time that this happened, there was a conference on rural Judaism that had gotten started in this area, and basically that included a lot of progressive type of Jews who came out of the Havurah movement from Boston. Rabbi Michael Paley, who was the rabbi down at Dartmouth, and R.D. Eno from Cabot, Vermont.
Susanna Heschel.
No.
That was later?
No, she never was involved with the conference.
Okay.
So, So about that time, I had become president of the synagogue and I was president for 8 years or so. And then after I was president, I became like executive director or whatever, administrator. And so the conference was always looking for speakers. And I went down to scout a speaker, Julius Lester, the convert to Judaism, the civil rights activist, who was that professor at UMass Amherst, the writer of 30, 40 books, children, adult books. And so I went down to he was giving a talk at Dartmouth, so I decided to go down, and the board wanted me to see, how he was and whether it would fit and all this sort of thing. And I went down to Dartmouth and arrived and sat in the audience, and he talked, and the black students at Dartmouth at that particular time, African American students, started giving him a hard time because he had converted to Judaism and because he was married to a white woman, and the fact that he was thrown out of the Afro-American department at UMass Amherst and went into the Judaica department and a couple other departments. And it was awful. He was treated so awfully that night. So I went up to him afterwards and said, I'm really sorry you had to go through this, that, no one should really have to be treated like the way you were. You're invited to a college, and, you can't have an open conversation where people are haranguing you and going after you for different things. And we became friends. And so then we had this experience with the student rabbi from Hebrew Union College. And the community, after she had come for the holidays, was in a little bit of flux because it was a great disappointment. People were upset. They didn't know what to make of it. It was a bit trying, and they didn't understand. And so then someone suggested, maybe we should bring someone in to lead us, come up and lead a service. And so this is December, a couple months after the holidays.
So
I can't remember the exact date.
77?
No, it wouldn't be 77. It would be more near 80.
80.
Yeah,
Roughly
80, 79, 80. Mm-hmm. So I said, well, I met this guy. He's a convert to Judaism, and he's very charismatic, has a great cantorial voice, and he does some services down in, I can call him up and ask him if he would like to come. And so I called him up, and he said, oh, sure, I'll come up for the weekend. And, we rented a motel room, and he was very easy to work with. And he came up, and people loved him. And we had a huge amount of people. And so everybody was looking around and saying, oh my God, what's going on here? And so then there was some people made some decisions, and they said, well, let's have him come up, periodically. And then it became once a month, and then the holidays. And we sort of got some stability. And also the membership increased. We went from 15 to 20 to 60, 62 members, 64 members. Families and singles, So it was pretty incredible. So he offered a lot. Well, he was a captivating speaker. He could daven with the best of them, and so he 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 also had the same opinion that I did, that the word minchag, laws of the community, and he mostly didn't stray from that. The community has a certain way they did things, that he was going to honor that, for the most part. On some things, of course, you can if you're a religious leader, and but he did, and for many years it was very successful, and he brought a lot of joy. There's always criticisms about any leader who would come, but on the whole, I've always said to people, protect what you have, because one day you won't have it.
Yeah.
So.
Seems to me also that at the same time, this is Beth, Dave's wife, the change from meeting in rented property to meeting in a synagogue that belonged to the congregation, the Sisterhood, it advanced as an organization, but it matured into something that took a lot of responsibility for the oneg after each service, and that became really important and famous.
Yeah, the onegs, certainly, I will have to say, food, the Jewish food issue is always an important factor, no matter where. But the people who did the onegs generally, there were some exceptions, they did a spectacular job, and of course that added to it. And the people took extreme pride in what they were doing. I mean, so it was nice. It was nice that occurred, and that it was pretty consistent. And people, I think at one point they had 20 some odd different individuals doing it on a periodic basis. But the interesting thing was, there had been some argument before the synagogue was built with the Sisterhood, and I don't know what it was, because it was really before my time, and that sort of dissolved. But what got flipped was that they had these group of guys who would be who would start doing the meals, like putting on dinners and things like that. Or so all of a sudden it was the guys who were doing it. It was the total opposite of whatever I was used to in New Haven or whatever. The women were basically the ones in charge, and so this got flipped. We had a couple individuals who were very talented and liked to do it. A guy named Gene Aronoff and a couple other people. So it was kind of an interesting thing to watch, that side take place.
When did the patrilineal descent issue start to come up?
Well, the patrilineal descent issue started to come up because, the synagogue always had a lot of folks who were intermarried. Mm-hmm. And the intermarried folks were welcome just like anybody else, and if you talk to the old timers or the folks who were there for years and years, it was never mentioned that someone was Jewish or non-Jewish or whatever. Of course, by Jewish law, there's certain rules. They can't go to Torah. They can't. But that never was a big issue, and then at some point the patrilineal issue came up because more and more people were moving into the area who were, intermarried, and, what kind of things could they do? What could their wives perform in the ceremonies, or what could the husbands performing the ceremonies.
B'nai mitzvah.
And, yeah, so we spent a long. B'nai mitzvahs was another important factor, and it became a year or 2 year long discussion, very involved and very. We brought in rabbis. We brought in, a couple people from Burlington, and to discuss it and to to talk about the different things, and it part of it was also painful because of just the whole discussion of it, because people right away. So they eventually came up with some decisions, and they basically came up with the decisions, although no one would remember this now, basically to deal with the children and not with the adults. For bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs and ceremonies and things like that. And some people just couldn't understand why their significant others couldn't be called to the Torah. Mm-hmm. And even if it was explained to them by someone who was rational and could explain it, they just couldn't. In Vermont, we think everything and everybody should be equal and everything like that. Then you mix religion in with it that has certain laws and regulations and all that sort of thing. So it was a really tough discussion, and we spent a lot of time and effort and on it, and it was worth it. But at the same time, it was also very difficult.
And was that after you had moved into the?
Yes, we were already in the building, and the demographics were as such that people actually, at some point, there's always been Jews up here, but they haven't belonged to the synagogue. There's still Jews here who don't belong to the synagogue, but now I believe less and less Jews are moving up here into this neck of the woods, to the Northeast Kingdom. That my observation.
Another thing that intrigued me when I started coming to the synagogue with you in 2002 was when Julius wasn't here.
Yes.
Those services were led by lay leaders also, and there was a long list of people actually who led services, and there were 2 different sets of sidurs.
Right.
For people who had different views of Judaism and wanted to lead services 2 different ways.
Yeah, and one of the things that we did over the years, when I was president, we updated our high holiday books. We updated the books for Friday night services, Saturday morning services, and this was a huge change because it meant, a huge outlay, buying 150 books for one portion of from one part of 150 books for another, and but then also. Things were changing in the Jewish world too, and so even those books at some point or other fastly became a little bit outdated because of people wanting to have more equality, and so that also became a bit of a problem here and there, but. After you get 300 books, and you're a small congregation, and you don't have any big donors, what do you do? So, we did a lot, and we had built the building, and at some point, I knew the day was coming where we needed handicap access. And I I I decided that the only way I was going to be able to do it was to form a committee and have them start doing one thing, getting a ramp into the building. And because I felt that there was some people who were having trouble getting into the building. And I felt that we needed to provide access to them. And so what we did is we built the ramp, and then after we got the ramp, I said, well, we have the ramp, and that's working out really well, but we really need a stair glide for people to get to the basement. And so then we raised the money to get the stair glide for people to get. And people said, even some of our more progressive members of the synagogue, well, if someone's in a wheelchair, we'll carry them down the stairs. And I said, you guys are not going to always, you guys are 40 or 50 now, you're not going to always be 40 or 50 and carry someone down a set of stairs. And there's a matter of dignity and all that sort of thing. So we got the stair glide put in, and a couple weeks after we got the stair glide put in, someone had broken their leg or whatever, and they wanted to come to services, and it was great that we were able to have it. And the oldest member of the synagogue eventually was using the stair glide to get up and down in the only way he could.
The restrooms were downstairs.
And the restrooms were downstairs, and so the only thing that we never got to, which I really tried to, and I just couldn't get done, was I wanted them to have better access to the bima. Because, even though it was a couple steps, there was no rails on those steps. And it never got done. And it's really it's somewhat unfortunate.
Yeah, someone did eventually fall.
Yeah, and not only there was 2 incidents. One guy actually fell off of the bima during a holiday thing, and then one of our older members, unfortunately, toppled over onto our leader, Julius Lester, and caused some damage.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm going to slip downstairs and put a little Jewish food together.
Oh, okay.
But there's a ton of topics there, and I'm wondering if maybe you could talk about some of the people you invited into the synagogue.
Over the years, we invited a lot of people, to be guest speakers and things like that. We were lucky to have Dartmouth and some from Burlington and that type of thing. So we were fortunate to do that.
And outside of the synagogue life, what have your experiences been as being, a Jew and a largely non-Jewish?
Well, it was for me. It was a different experience because I worked at a college, and so right away I sort of was the one everybody went to if there was Jewish issues and whatnot, and sometimes that was a mixed blessing. Like one of the college administrators wanted to have a Christmas party, and he wanted to say it was more like a Unitarian, or I forget what he was going, universal Christmas party with all religions. I explained to him that that's not really what Jews don't participate in that type of thing, and so I was and some Jewish kids would come, and they would want to come to the synagogue, and but they even when they did come, they found it rather small and rather tiny compared to where they were from. So, sometimes they couldn't wrap their heads around it. And I understood that completely. Mm-hmm. You're coming from an more urban place, and they're bigger, and, they got all the cantors and rabbis and help and all this other sort of thing, and more formal seating than we had, so the kids came here and there, and but we were, I was happy when they did the Anne Frank play at the college. I was able to get, some posters, and I got people to donate money to get more books about the Holocaust in the library. And so that was, those are some nice things. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And try to get people to understand a little bit about the Jewish world. Yeah. So.
And well, I guess I should wait till Beth comes back. So I wanted to ask you about meeting her and her joining the synagogue and that
right
kind of thing too. But are there any other sort of stories that stand out to you about your experiences here?
Oh, there's so many. I mean, there's so many stories, about trying to keep a community together, and, petty arguments, and, people doing nice things for people, and, so it's a whole mixture of things. And for many years, we had a outstanding group of people who basically, were committed to, keeping this institution and keeping Judaism going, and really participating in as fully as they could. But it took a lot of effort. It took a lot of care. And I think what started transpiring is that what we kept on hearing, unfortunately, is that, the kids from the synagogue who are participating had so many outside activities that their parents were just in a dilemma about what activity that their kid should participate in. And so sometimes Hebrew school is the one that got dropped. Hockey was included, or football, or whatever. And, so the other thing is we kept our dues as minimal as possible. Mm-hmm. For most of the time that I remember, the dues were $175, $250, and I think they went up to $450 within the last number of years. But they were pretty practical. Yeah. Compared to, my friends tell me what they pay at other places, and your eyes just roll. Yeah. And I know they have a lot more services at other places, but so the way I looked at it, as far as Bethel was concerned, is that if we needed something in the building, and we can make a case for it, that people would donate to make sure that happened. And almost without fail, it always happened that way. People would step to with not huge amounts of money. Right. It wasn't a huge amount of money type of thing, but they would step forward and make sure. Like when we first got Julius Lester, people donated to make sure that we can provide some funds for him to come. So that's how that started, and then it became part of the synagogue budget.
And did the synagogue, or does the synagogue have other like activities that they do, or
They do, and
something?
they more. I can't speak for the recent part of it because we have um, for the recent part of it, but they've been recently. The synagogue always had people from the synagogue going out if a local community organization wanted someone to talk or whatever. We had members like Rosalie Harris and Ben Harris who would go out and do it, and some other people. And more recently, they've gotten involved in a lot of interfaith activities in the area. So yeah, and we were always involved in that to some extent. Um, so
And there used to be a sisterhood, but they
there
don't do
used
that
to be a
anymore?
sisterhood before, you know, somewhat before I became involved. And I just, I've heard, a couple of different things, and it sort of dissolved because of some internal conflicts with um, a few of the individuals. And I don't really know the story of it, the full story, unfortunately. And at some point, some people were saying that they wanted to start a men's, but they never did. But anyways, it maybe for a small place, maybe it was better not to have a men's or women's group, and maybe to have some group that did it together. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So there was always conflicts along the way and different things, and people wanted to you know we people wanted to see something done that couldn't be done, and if you try to explain it to them, we had one particular person who was converting to Judaism but hadn't converted, and she felt like she wanted to lead services, and we kept on telling her that until you're Jewish you can't really lead a service. And finally, she was pretty insistent on it, and I said to her, please go see Rabbi Wall in Burlington, and please talk to him and see what he has to say. So she went over to see Rabbi Wall, and that put an end to that put an end to that. So,
And so one of the things my students have been doing these kinds of interviews, and one thing they're asking about is if the community has sort of an orientation towards Israel, if that's
I would say the older members did have an orientation towards Israel, and I'm talking about Bethel had a core group of older members. They've been here since the 40s and 50s. They basically moved into town to be, one of them owned a furrier shop. One of them owned a men's clothing store that was also his brother owned one in Burlington. They were in partnership, and they had more of a stronger orientation towards Israel. I had an extremely strong orientation towards Israel, and for many different reasons. And so there was that group and then there was a group of folks who just didn't have any identity to Israel at all, and they just couldn't care. They didn't care. They didn't. So my identity to Israel was, I grew up in an Orthodox synagogue, and I just happened to, for some reason, when I was in college, I wanted to work on my thesis, and it was arms smuggling to Israel from the United States. And so I started meeting folks who were involved in doing that. And so it sort of cemented my interest in Israel. And the more I read about and met these interesting men and women, the more I sort of, and read about Israel. And, I was pretty well on my way to, being from, my grandfather was from Vilna, realizing that, he went over there in 1935, 1936 to go visit his family. And he never heard from them after he came back in 36. Never heard once from any of them that the handwriting was on the wall, that they were all dead. And at some point in the last 10 years, I kept on asking family members about my grandfather's trip there. He essentially went there to take out whatever family members wanted to come. So he went there by himself. And so I never knew the actual totality of the number of family members. And so one day I was talking to one of my aunts who has since passed away. And she says, "Oh, I have a picture of him with his family." And I said, "Man, can you, I said to my aunt, can you make a Xerox of that?" So she sent it up to me, and I couldn't believe it for the life of me. There was this picture with all these people. And I'm going, oh my God, not one of them was alive. They all disappeared. And so, yeah. So, and Israel essentially took in, whatever remnants there was, and, other places. But, so I was fortunate. I was able to meet, some individuals along the way who sort of, I had a rabbi from the old world, Abraham Hefterman. He was from Lithuania. I was fortunate enough to meet, important, Elie Wiesel 5 or 6 times. And a whole bunch of other people. I was fortunate enough to meet some refuseniks. So I sort of, it was sort of pointed in that way that Israel became this sort of haven. Mm-hmm. And then when I was a senior in college, I decided, well, I'm going to do something my professors won't know anything about. And, we have this book kicking around our house called The Pledge by Leonard Slater, and it was basically about the Americans who helped found the State of Israel. And so I decided to do the paper, and one of the principals was Hank Greenspun, who was editor of the Las Vegas Sun newspaper, owner of the Las Vegas Sun newspaper. And I was able to meet him and interview him, and then I interviewed 2 or 3 other individuals who were involved. And just sitting with them was, and interviewing them, and I didn't know what I was doing. I was an 18-year-old. I was winging it, and so I was listening to their stories. I was listening to, what they did and all that sort of thing. And so it was, it was amazing that they were able. These guys came after the war. They had come from being in the war. Hank Greenspun, my aunt's brother, Reynolds Selk, and they helped the state of Israel. They just had come from 5 years overseas. It became important to me. Yeah.
Shall we take a little break?
Sure. Sure.
This is really great. Recording.
So we were just talking about, stories and stuff like that. And when Raul Hilberg retired, the famous Holocaust scholar at UVM, I went over to the symposium they had for a number of days for him. And I took time off from work, and I thought it was an important gathering. And so I also took a bunch of books over to be signed by different people. And one of the books I went over to have signed was from Claude Lanzmann, who did the long documentary on Shoah. And he was standing with Hilberg, and I went up and said to him, Mr. Lanzmann, would you mind if you sign this book for me? And he says, I am not going to sign it. I didn't like the translation, the American translation, and it's an abysmal translation, and they did wrong by me, and on and on. And Raul Hilberg, who was also known as not being the most sympathetic person in the world, I guess, turned to him and said, Claude, all he wants is a signature. That's all he wants is a signature. Just give him the signature on the book. And I thought it was the most generous thing that, and obviously that Hilberg, had been interviewed for the Shoah by Lanzmann, and they had enough respect for each other. He signed the book. And, I walked away, and it was just an amazing thing. Then the other kind of amazing thing at that conference was that I got to meet Herman Walk. He was one of the speakers one night, and I can remember sitting with the person who's now head of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. She was at the table I was sitting at. And 2 or 3 other people from the Holocaust Museum were there. And so I was kind of timid about getting Herman Walk's signature because, he was such a, enormous figure and all this. So I decided, I couldn't bring all the books I had, but I decided to bring more of the older books. So I went up to him, and he looked, and he was not going to be impressed with signing books. And then he saw I had the older books. He says, you have my older books. I will gladly sign those. And so there was this twinkle, and he was happy that it wasn't his latest Winds of War books or whatever they were called. And it was the older books about, that he had.
You did the same thing with Stephen King.
Yes, I did the same thing with Stephen King once. Although we weren't supposed to approach him. We were at an event that Stephen King was speaking at, and also Jonathan Irving and Middlebury. And we were warned ahead of time that we weren't to bring any books. But I had a particular book that he wrote the introduction to. And by the famous noir writer Jim Thompson. So I brought the book with me because I knew it would be the only time I would ever. And so I saw him down in the hallway, and I walked down, and I said, I know I'm not supposed to do this, but I only have one chance. He saw what the book was. He says, I'm going to sign that book. So.
As opposed to when you met with Elie Wiesel, which was very different.
Yes. Yeah. Well, we met. I met with Elie Wiesel 5 or 6 times, different places: Dartmouth, University of Hartford,
Middlebury.
Middlebury. I don't know where that signed picture is. But
Take one look.
anyways, he was always very generous in giving, signing the books and things like that. And one of the events I went to was at Dartmouth, and a student invited me to he met in a room with 20 students or something. And there's a student who invited me to go see him. And I did, and I sort of got the Hillel rabbi at the time said, "How did you get up here?" And I said, "Well, this kid sort of invited me, and I went." He says, "You're not supposed to be here. It's only supposed to be for parents." And so he says, "You're not to ask him any questions. It's just for parents." And I kept my mouth shut.
That's fine. So tell me about the books, how you got started.
Well, the book thing was really kind of interesting. I was always sort of about the age of, I would say 12 or 13, somewhat interested in books. And then, back then I was mostly reading sports books or, that type of thing. And then, I went to college, and then, I started doing the, tremendous amount of reading about Israel, and then the Holocaust, and then after I left Linden State College, graduated, I went to work at University of New Hampshire for 3 years. And I studied with Solomon Paul, who was teaching a course on the Holocaust. And, that's it.
Wiesel.
Oh, yeah.
And
Grace Paley.
Grace Paley.
Oh, yeah.
And not so Jewish, but I just grabbed it at the same moment.
Oh, God.
Do you know who that is?
Bob Dole.
Oh, that's Bob Dole. Wow, that's a face I haven't seen in a long time.
One of my friends was sponsoring him in Littleton, New Hampshire. And so
you were doing the research.
So I was doing the research on the books on the smuggling of weapons to Israel, the creation of the Jewish state, and by Americans. And so I started, collecting, gathering different books on it, and realizing that the libraries just didn't have anything. It was amazing. It was like this blank slate. You couldn't get anything. So I started perusing used bookstores and gathering up what I could gather, fortunately my father worked for the railroad, so I had a pass, and I was allowed to go to New York by myself, even when I was a teenager. And most of the times when I went to New York as a teenager, it was to go to a sporting goods store. But later on, it was the Strand bookstore and a bunch of used bookstores in New York City, in the Jewish Museum. And so so what I would do is I would go to the Strand bookstore, and books were relatively inexpensive back then, believe it or not. And so I used to buy, a number of books. And at first I would lug them back on the train. And then I realized that they would ship them. And it actually became easier to have them shipped than lug them on the train and all this sort of thing. So I was gathering books, and then I got the University of New Hampshire, and studied with a man named Solomon Paul, who was a rabbi. He was a teenager during the Holocaust, and he taught sociology. And he wanted to teach a course on the Holocaust. His doctors didn't want him to do it. He had a number of heart attacks. So he had 6 kids in the class, 3 Jews, 3 non-Jews. 3 Jewish kids believed there was a Holocaust. 3 non-Jewish kids didn't believe there was a Holocaust.
And that long ago, 1974?
No, this was maybe 1976 or something, 75, around that time period. And the Jewish kids were just amazed. They were just like, oh God, what's going on here? So he assigned us these readings, these books to read. Oh, we went to the library. They didn't have the damn books. So here's a conundrum, that, they don't have the books. They don't have books on the Holocaust. So, again, I started going to used bookstores and I said to myself at that particular point in time, there wasn't a lot of books in the mid-70s, believe it or not, being published on the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. So I said, well, let me gather what I can gather up, and maybe I had this notion of some type of that I would gather up this number of books on the Holocaust that I was saving them, So what transpired was that it started becoming a hobby. I started going to used bookstores in New England and Maine and New Hampshire and different places, and it started. I was single. I didn't have any, dependents and things like that. So I would gather up books and, I found fascinating things. Back then you were able to find things before the internet.
Yeah. Tell the John Hersey story.
Yeah. Well, in New Haven, John Hershey taught at Yale, and he wrote the book on the wall that became, very famous. He also wrote a book on Hiroshima. And so he was moving out of New Haven, and he donated a bunch of books to a group. I forget what they called it was 5 women colleges who ran a bookstore in New Haven, and part of it was in this older section, and then in the basement down these really steep stairs, and this unbelievably bad basement full of books. So I would go down the basement because the Judaica was down there, and I come across a couple new boxes of books that they had just gotten, and it was from John Hershey's collection.
His personal books.
His personal books, and so he and some of them, he had done the research on the wall and had used them. And then, as I said before, in this collection of books was a book signed by Hershey from the head of the Vilna ghetto fighters, and Abner Hillel Kovner, and so. I couldn't imagine having this book. I couldn't imagine having a book signed by Abba Hillel Kovner at all, because, I knew, from my, that my grandfather was from Vilna, that this guy played an integral role in the resistance movement. And so I gathered up the couple boxes of books, wrestled them upstairs, paid, whatever they were, went to the car, put them in the trunk, and got the hell out of there as fast as possible, and with this treasure in the back of the car. Yeah. And, so.
And the Brandeis story?
Yes. Well, the Brandeis story is a little bit is another interesting story. There's a couple who own the bookstore downtown in Lindenville. His name was Ralph Seacard. He owned Green Mountain Books. And he's a former librarian down in Hartford area and moved up here and opened up a used bookstore. And he would call me when he had any Judaica books. And he would let me have first crack at them, which I was enormously pleased about that. And so he calls me up one day and he says, I have this Brandeis book I just got, and it's signed by his wife. So I said, I'll be there after work. It was on a Friday. So I go down, and the book's $2.50. And I go, okay, here's $2.50. And I get it home, and a couple hours later, I decide I'm going to look at the book, start. It was a small book. And so I'm looking at the book, and I started opening up the pages, and I see, there's his wife's name on the flyleaf page. And then I go 2 or 3 pages in, and there's the justice's signature. And I go, oh my God, I don't understand how this even happened. So I call his
the bookstore.
son. No, I call his son-in-law, who was a professor at the college in English. And I said to him, look, I got a dilemma. I got this book from your father-in-law, and here's the dilemma. I paid $2.50 for this book, and it has the justice's signature in it, and there's no way that the book's worth more than $2.50. Now, this is a long time ago. You're talking about 1980s. It's worth more than $2.50. And he said, Dave, that's the book business. It happens, and you don't owe him anything. It's just the way the book business is.
Yep.
And but I was enormously happy to have the book by Brandeis.
So while you're on Justices,
yes,
pardon me for prompting stories, but Justice Rehnquist.
Yes, I met Justice Rehnquist twice. Once at Ohavi Zedek, and he signed something for me, a cartoon.
Oh, wow.
That wasn't totally complimentary to him. And then we were at this church in Barnet where he gave a talk on rights. What was it? Rights
In time of war.
Rights in time of war. This is, and we weren't. I would say a couple of us weren't totally happy with what he had to say that night, because he was sort of insinuating that we would lose some of our rights in the time of war. And so anyways, we brought a couple books for him to sign, one at least. Then there was my friend asked him to sign a book, and he had a notoriously bad back, and he didn't want to sign anything. We were outside of the building, and he said, they said, we got to get the justice home. His back is not well. Blah, blah, blah. So, but he finally decided he'd sign the books, and then a college administrator who was retired at the time, Dick Boera, had this book that he wanted to have signed by the justice. And the justice said, well, it's not a book I wrote, and I feel uncomfortable signing it.
It was about him.
It had something to do with him, but he was uncomfortable signing it. And I said to him, Justice Rehnquist, he's a World War II veteran, and he holds you in very high regard. And Rehnquist says to me, "Can I use your back?" He puts the book on my back and then signs it for him. So.
Take a drink.
Okay.
Can I try to tell the Trotsky story and you can correct me if I get it wrong?
Go ahead.
Well, because Dave was known for being a book collector and being interested in books, he kind of lucked into this particular collection. Leon Trotsky, had a bodyguard named Harold Robbins. And Robbins failed in his job. Trotsky was murdered. Mm-hmm. Robbins settled into Woodsville, New Hampshire, 15 miles south of here on the Connecticut River. And Robbins' family despised him for failing at his job and for being a communist.
Well, not for failing. They didn't despise him for failing at his job.
More for being a communist.
For being a communist.
All right. So when Robbins died in Woodsville, New Hampshire, his family rented a dumpster and began to throw all his possessions into it. All his books, all the photographs, all the letters. And some of them were rescued by a friend of Dave's, who went dumpster diving at the time. And they worked their way up to the same bookstore where he'd gotten the Brandeis book. And so we have here a photograph of Trotsky taken by his bodyguard in Mexico and a letter to Mr. Robbins, the failed bodyguard.
Oh my gosh.
Yep.
Yeah. Really cool.
Yeah. Good. I only got corrected once.
Yes.
I'm getting better.
So, basically, the books became sort of an obsession. And it became sort of a habit. Mm-hmm. And since I didn't drink and I didn't go to bars and things like that, it became a hobby. And the hobby was, whenever I had vacation time or whatever, I would go to used bookstores here and there. And when in a time when there was used bookstores. Now, as you know, the landscape has changed, and there's fewer and fewer and fewer of them. So, over a period of time, I mostly traveled New England and New York, and, that's what I would do.
So we met in a used bookstore
right.
when we were 50, both
right.
of us. And for our honeymoon, we went to San Francisco to shop in used bookstores.
And how many books do you have now that are in Jewish?
Well, in the Jewish collection, there's about 7,000.
Of which about 5,000 are now cataloged.
Right.
And the rest are the signed special things that we kept upstairs that we...
Yeah, the signed books that I wasn't, the Elie Wiesel's that are all signed, that Aaron Appelfeld's, David Mamet's, things like that.
There's one corner that we didn't cover, just because we sort of skipped past it, and it's not particularly Jewish, but I think it's a fun part of your life. Mm-hmm. At least I thought so when I met you, and I still think so. And it happened in part because your first job before you came back to Lyndon State was at the University of New Hampshire, where all the political candidates came through running for president.
Yeah.
So you began to meet them.
Yeah, it was hard not to meet people at University of New Hampshire. Ford was there, President Ford came, Ronald Reagan was there, Jimmy Carter. I remember meeting in a small room with 20 people and walking out of the room with my friend Jeff Crocker saying, how does this guy ever think he's going to become president? This peanut farmer from Georgia thinks he's going to be president. And so we, they were all there. It was hard. You could not go, but it was hard. That was part of the entertainment. And so we got to see a lot of different political leaders. And like one who died last week, Birch Bayh, I worked for him for a little while. when he was trying to run for president, and I was working on the campus for him, and he had these, I don't know, Secret Service guards at a time, and so I had to bring him over to the college television station to be interviewed, and so he's with these Secret Service, and he needed to go to the bathroom. They walked in the bathroom with him, and I said, if that's what it takes to be president, I would want no part of it. That's going a bit too far.
Is that where you met Walter Cronkite too?
No, Walter Cronkite was a horse. One of the things I did at the college is I was director of residential life, assistant dean of students. They kept on changing the titles. And we had this salesman I used to buy a lot of furniture from. And he belonged to some club down in, the Hyannis or somewhere. And he always used to regale me with Walter Cronkite stories. So I said to him, Don, he's an older man. I said, oh, Don, I liked Walter Cronkite. I'd love a signed picture. And so he got me a signed picture of Cronkite.
Signed to you.
Signed to me.
Yep.
And interestingly enough, at Linden State, Cronkite's daughter spent some time there as a student. And for many years had some land up here. And at one point, they were trying to get Cronkite to be the commencement speaker. But that never happened. So, yeah.
Then when we got together, we realized that between the two of us, we knew a lot about a couple of categories of books, and we opened a specialty book business, initially in Vermont books and poetry and mysteries. We soon discovered that Vermont books, although we loved them, did not sell, so we dropped them. And in poetry, we went around and met dozens of people, many of them Pulitzer Prize winners and poets laureate.
Yep.
And became very fond of several, including Donald Hall,
Yep.
with whom you always shared baseball jokes.
Yeah, stories.
Maxine Kumin, who was also Jewish. Galway Kanell, who lived nearby.
Grace Paley.
Grace Paley, whom you've talked about as your Jewish grandmother.
Yeah, my Vermont Jewish grandmother.
Yep. And we did the same thing with mysteries. And mysteries ended up being the genre we held on to the longest time. So we began to go to mystery conventions so that we could meet people like Michael Connolly. Who were some of the other ones that were exciting to meet? Walter Mosley.
Max Allen Collins.
Yeah.
Louise Penny a number of times.
Yes. Louise sent you her regards fairly recently, by the way.
Okay. And so we met a lot of, we met a lot of authors over the years. We've got a lot of books signed by authors, and so we sort of enjoyed doing that. At first, Beth was very timid about doing it, and I sort of, we sort of had a teacher.
Yep.
You can't be timid about getting things signed. And
maybe one of the strangest moments that first year that we were together, we went to visit my mother's cousin Alice Eckhart.
Yes.
She and her husband are scholars in the field of Christian-Jewish connection. And they are very strongly on the Christian side, but they wrote dozens of books. And we walked into the hall, and there was a picture of Elie Wiesel,
Yeah.
who had been a close friend of theirs and visited the house often. So suddenly Dave is sitting down with my mother's cousin talking Elie Wiesel.
Yeah. Well, Roy Eckhart was also considered a Holocaust scholar.
Very much.
And so they had a tremendous amount of books on the Holocaust in their collection. And I never met Roy, but Alice was just an incredible individual. And then there becomes another tie-in with them because there was a couple who used to come up here to visit, and it turned out that they were in the same department at Lehigh University, a Jewish
Jewish couple.
As Alice and Roy. So you never know in the Jewish world. There's always some connection back and forth.
Yeah.
And I didn't know much about the Jewish side of my family because my dad took one of the familiar paths of emigres. He put his Judaism behind him, supposedly, although he always worked for Jewish-owned companies and had other strong ties, but he wouldn't talk about it. He had come out of Germany in 1933 when Hitler came to power. His folks had put him into boarding school, and he'd gone back for vacations and such until 1938. And then there was the horror of the war and British boarding school and all of that. And when Dave and I first began to talk, we were at a book event at a library, and we ended up talking about my mother's cousins and the Holocaust in terms of that. And Dave asked what my father's name had been. And then Dave went home, and the next thing I know, he's letting me know, I have books about your father's family in my collection.
Yeah. Well, so, my book thing became, really, it was sort of like what I wanted to do and what I liked to do. And also, tangentially, when someone would ask me something, can you help me out with something? I had the books to sort of back it up. They certainly didn't have them in the Northeast Kingdom. Mm-hmm. And in some cases in Vermont, that, the holdings of even, I think UVM is probably up to snuff now, but some of the places just didn't have much in the way of books on Judaism and the Holocaust.
So in order to move to this house in 2005, we had to pack up all of the books that Dave had collected. And they covered entire rooms and they went to the ceiling. And I sorted as I packed, because that's the kind of person I am. Yes. I'm a sorter and organizer.
She's the...
So soon I knew that Dave had multiple books of memoirs from each of the camps during the Holocaust. He had children's and women's memoirs. He had material written by people who'd been midwives. He had books on the gypsies, which are really scarce. He had books on homosexuals being persecuted during the Holocaust. He has a stunning collection of anti-Semitism material. And books on Jews in America, Jews in Russia, Jews in Canada, multiple books on Jews in Manitoba, Jews in Africa, Jews in Japan, Jews in China. Yep.
Well, the Manitoba, the reason there's books on Jews in Manitoba was that there was a rabbi in the New Haven area named Cheel, and he wrote about local Jewish history, and we became very friendly. And so he originally was a rabbi in Manitoba and got that whole community started. And I just felt, that I wanted to, read about his early beginnings. And, then he came down to New Haven and then Woodbridge. And he was, just an incredible rabbi. And his brother was a rabbi in Boston, another Cheel. And so I was fortunate because when I was younger that there was some role models out there that were, incredible individuals. It's like Rabbi Wall, in the Burlington community. I don't know if you knew Rabbi Wall at all, but he was beloved in the community, and he was there for someone. He came as a chaplain after the war. Yeah. And stayed there all those years. Well, so I was able to meet, some rabbis in New Haven who acted like that, and the head of the Jewish Federation, he was another guy. If I needed to talk to somebody as far as doing my papers, he would give me names and lead me in the direction. And I was fortunate because I was thinking about this the other day. My grandfather was a Jewish kosher butcher. My one of my uncles sold yeast for bakeries. And I was around during this period when all this stuff was almost coming to an end. You know, they went from 16 or 18 Jewish butchers in New Haven to there's one tiny place now. You know, the Jewish bakeries that were there, there's none now. So, you know, I was able to see it during, I think, the last phases of, and this is the, so when I came up to Vermont, I sort of, with Beth Synagogue, I sort of thought it may be my mission to make sure that things weren't extinguished up here. So now
we're very fortunate. We have our family growing more Jewish in
Yes.
new ways.
Yes.
We're now linked to Mindy's family through Kiril, and Kiril has become a Jew. So I sort of wondered if you wanted to ask some questions, having listened to so much today. Either
I
of
feel like I should
you.
have done more preparation for that.
Well, I have one question.
Sure.
You grew up in an Orthodox family, or something?
Yeah, we grew up in I would say we grew up in an Orthodox synagogue, principally because they liked the rabbi,
Your parents
who was
liked the rabbi.
he was an old world scholar who was not flashy, or you know, he was a guy of immense integrity. He wrote for the Forward, the Yiddish Forward. He had a weekly column. He was, you know, just one of these really sincere individuals. And so they joined that synagogue. But I would say they were conservative. They kept a kosher home, but outside the home they didn't keep kosher. So my grandfather was a kosher butcher, and certainly his home was totally kosher until the day he passed away. So
And so that wasn't a path that you followed in your home?
well, I kind of wonder if I stayed in the New Haven area. It could have been a path I would have taken. It certainly was very difficult to do in Vermont.
That's what I was going to say.
That's okay. I don't.
Well, I wondered if you would tell us about your tallis.
Okay. Well, during we went to Israel. A friend and myself went to Israel in 1975, 76. We went for 3 weeks, and so we bought taluses there, and I also bought one for my father, who never had his own. And Mea Shearim went into a Jewish shop and bought taluses, and more recently, because I always had trouble with yarmulkes falling off, in the last 15 years I've been wearing ones that would stay on my head. It took me a long time to learn.
So you mentioned before, when we didn't have the camera on, that there was a period of time in the synagogue when people were bringing in new practices that didn't feel so.
Well, most recently, I would say 7 or 8 years. 7, 8 years, 6 years.
I would have said 5, but
5.
you might
Okay,
be right.
yeah. You know, and I think what transpired was that I'm trying to be kind to it, and I know it's just a hard thing. I think some people came in to the synagogue, and they had every right to, try to do what they wanted to do. But what happened was they kept on talking about wanting to be more inclusive and things like that. And so I think for me, the first signs that there was some issues going on was that a particular person wanted to be bat mitzvahed, but she wanted her non-Jewish friends to have aliyahs. And this became a discussion for, a number of weeks and a couple of different board meetings, and it was tearing at some of the fabric, because basically if there I think in order to criticize the tradition, you have to know the tradition. I know that's kind of, sounds kind of strange, but I've always felt that way. That if you're going to criticize something, you have to really know what you're criticizing. Mm-hmm. So I think it started off with that, and then it kept on emerging. And things just kept on unraveling a little bit. And it's funny because I was always told by rabbis in Burlington, God, you guys over in the Northeast, over in St. Jay, you're able to keep it together, while some of the other synagogues have sort of split because of different, different religious things. And then for some reason an incident transpired we had a rabbi visit, and there was some undermining of the rabbi, and by one of the people thought he was too conservative, and didn't like the what?
I was going to say not all people.
Not all people,
but this one group of people who were, whose guideline was that it wasn't good Judaism if it didn't speak to them personally.
Right, and also there was a factor of that he never became a rabbi, but he went to Hebrew Union College, and he was a student rabbi here many years ago. And then he went into the United States Army as an intelligence officer. And some people held that against him. And so I personally had some problems with that, because, God bless him. He was leading services all over the world when he was doing his intelligence thing. And, he did the synagogue. Some leaders of the synagogue approached me, and they asked me if I can get a hold of him and to do services here. And I said, I will get a hold of him. He's a friend. I won't negotiate with him. But then they
fought with him once he got here.
Then two or three of them, just for some reason, they couldn't get on. They didn't communicate well with him, and they made a mountain out of a molehill and made a mess. And then one of the persons started undermining him, and it was just tragic, and that he was they considered him a conservative Jew, and that they wanted something that was
more radical,
more progressive or whatever.
Two other things in my perspective were happening at the same time. Mm-hmm. One was that the Jews who had experienced the movement out of the department store into a building of their own, those Jews began to die off or go to Florida. So that core group that was so rooted was suddenly gone.
Yeah.
And the other was that although there had been many B'nai Mitzvahs over the years, there had become almost a habit of parents kind of withdrawing from participation after their kids' B'nai Mitzvahs were done, and the kids not being interested in pursuing it further, so that the next generation wasn't filling in the same way.
Yeah, and basically, I think there's some turning points in every organization, where you see things going south. But I think what started happening also is people wanted an easier path. So instead of bar or bar mitzvahing their child in the more traditional way, they wanted to do it at 2:00 in the afternoon.
For a short service.
To have more of a short service. And, I'm not saying me, but I always, my thought about the bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah process was that it actually did help a kid gain confidence and gain ability. Because, you're about ready to go, near high school or junior high. And this was sort of, it's sort of before you did that you would gain this confidence and learning and relating and doing all this hard work. So when you got to school, you would have some knowledge of what. So people started wanting to take the real easy way out, and also some parents just didn't want to put in the time.
When I first met Dave, he was administrative, executive, everything for the synagogue. And he would coach whoever was going to lead services. He would coach the president of the board, the president of the congregation through the high holidays. Here's how we work out the aliyahs. Here's who you ask.
All that sort of thing.
The phone would ring dawn to dusk during the month before the high holidays. Just one need after another, and Dave would be meeting them all. There would be parents whose children were getting close to, they'd be 11 and 12. They'd already be calling Dave and saying, who's going to tutor my child? And these were long-term relationships with the tutor. They were 6 months or more.
Yeah.
And Dave had at least 2 people he could refer people to.
And we always thought that, at least I always thought it was better for them to start earlier than later, so that the curve wouldn't be as drastic. And, so anyways. And at that particular point in time, I knew all the, I sort of knew all the rabbis in Vermont, that not that there was so many of them, and a couple in New Hampshire. The rabbi and at Dartmouth used to help out once in a while if we can. Things have changed. We at one time during the height of the Hebrew school, they had 18 students, and now they have a couple. So it's things have changed.
I want to pull the plug.
Good.
I want to say you've talked for more than 2 hours.
Okay.
Time to.
That's fine with me.
Yeah.
Is there anything you want to?
Oh, this is wonderful.
Okay. Is there anything you?
I can't think of anything else. Really. Yes. Did you have any questions?
Well, the one thing that I thought of, maybe less historical, but I still think it was the question that came to my mind is, as I've been learning about Judaism and getting to the process, I found 2 things that really meant a lot to me. One is just the community, right? Which we've talked a lot about, which is amazing, and it's half the point,
right?
Almost, right? And maybe more than half the point. And to hear what it's taken to keep a community going and how much work that is, it's a lifetime of work,
right?
Which is pretty inspiring. The other is that I know that you follow the politics much more closely than I do. I can't
Yeah.
I can't take it, so I don't
Right.
look at it closely. But I think a lot about. I still owe my rabbi half of my conversion work, a paper on. I'm trying to write about was like. I kind of feel that Judaism has a practical sort of framework for life and a morality and a code that like struck me as being surprisingly modern actually and surprisingly usable in society today.
Right.
When it feels like we're missing that, and it feels like the sense of community, the sense of empathy, the simple basics of what's right and wrong in life, right?
The connections across generations.
Mm-hmm. That we need. And like I don't know if this is a question or the question, but like I think like how do we
get it back?
How do we get it back, or how do we teach more people that, right? To me, the point, right? There's the book, but there's also like teaching and trying to help other people understand these things that are really valuable.
How did you step into it? What drew you into it?
Well, I fell in sideways, right? I mean, I used to call I've always called our family post-Jewish, right? Mm-hmm. Or Jew-Jew-ish, like growing up here. Which, by the way, growing up here and knowing that our family was Jewish was really odd because I didn't grow up knowing there were any other Jews or any Jews at all. We weren't Jewish, but like, I felt like I was the only token Jewish person around. Mm-hmm. And so going to it was partly her prompting, partly my own wanting to explore that and learn more about the family and the history. But also I started to meet people. I was like, these are just my people. Like, I'm used to this, right? Like.
So I think that's your answer. I think for almost everybody to step into a new way of learning a moral structure, a structure for life, comes through becoming friends with one person who says, come see what I'm doing. Mm. Come feel what it's like when my friends and I get together. Come experience this with me.
Mm. What do you think, Dave?
Yeah, I think I agree with you. Beth's family is interesting because her father, came to the States and wanted to. All her brothers and sisters have different religions. It's so interesting to me. It's so fascinating.
I did when we moved to West Barnet, which would be 1986. Well, so 1989 when we popped out of the glassworks and I was kind of on my own for the first time. And I knew that I wanted something in the way of spirituality in my life. I did go to the synagogue. I only knew one person then, and it was Rosalie.
Rosalie, right.
And Rosalie firmly told me that what my father had told me as a child was correct, that I could not be Jewish because my mother was not Jewish. So
Which is no longer
under
most of Jewish.
It's no longer true in Reform Judaism.
Right.
It's no longer true in conservative, well, if you're raised, but patriotal is now recognized.
Right. But you heard Dave explaining how it was hashed out at the synagogue here, and that happened after I had asked, after I'd knocked on the door.
Right.
So that's one partial answer to why you didn't know anybody else. Another was the friction I had with my dad in those years. That if I had been closer to my dad, you would have met more people around him.
Yeah, not that I'm worried about it. It was the watching other people approaching it who had more distance. Mm-hmm. I could see how much harder it was. Whereas I just felt like, okay, I know these people, I just don't know the rules and the words and stuff.
Isn't that interesting? So, I felt like when I walked into the synagogue the first time, I felt like I was home.
A lot of it actually was when I met your family. Uh-huh. I met her family, and I was like, wait, this could just be my family. Like, I can't tell the difference really. Uh-huh. And I was like, why would I not want to join that club? Sounds perfect. Like, it feels like
I belong.
Yeah.
I think that's also just part of who you are. Some people are much more closed off to things like that, right? I mean, and so I think that's, it's part of somebody's personality. Like if you're willing to accept other types of people, and then it feels like it's easier to, I don't know.
Yeah, that struck me. Like, some of the community here has resisted change, but actually had it's sort of, I mean, this is like maybe the country, it's something about Vermont too. Like
Yeah.
Vermont's a very weird place where there's a mixture of very conservative and very liberal, and there's some shocking diversity in weird
a real
ways.
dichotomy of, from one spectrum to the other in a lot of regards. Northeast Kingdom is still somewhat conservative, and you have, and there's pockets of liberalism here, but certainly as you head over to other parts of the states, it's much more liberal than here.
But this is still the place where, if Dave wanted to, he could call up Maxine. I always I twist the two names together. Okay, Cunin, Governor Cunin, Madeline Cunin. There we go. If he wanted to, he could call up Madeline Cunin and say, I told you I was mixing the two names.
Yeah.
And say, remember when we talked in the 1980s about this and such? And go on with the conversation.
So have you ever experienced anti-Semitism around here?
Certainly.
Yeah.
If you would have to, if anybody says any Jewish person says they haven't had anti-Semitism up here, they have their head in the sand. There is a synagogue member who had kept on telling me that he never experienced anti-Semitism up here. And I know for a fact that he had anti-Semitic things happen to him. And it's just a matter of that he wanted to deny it. Yeah, so there, the interesting thing is in the 80s and 90s, we kept on having to talk to the local school communities about calendars and things like that. And it was very difficult because we kept on going over the same plowed field of, this is when the Jewish holidays are, and, especially, I probably shouldn't get into the politics of it, but a couple of the schools were very reluctant to ever, they kept on insisting that the kids go to school during the Jewish holidays, so to speak. Didn't make allowances that the high holidays were. And some of the smaller schools, people also had. I would get calls often about it. And a lot of times it could be worked out, but some of the times it was just, why do we have to keep on going over the same thing with the same school over and over again? It's not that big. It's only a couple of days. What do we, why can't we make some allowances for those couple of days? And so.
The two other things that are important to me in that. One is that we just lost last year one of the longest serving doctors in this region, a pediatrician who gave his life and was still seeing children and their parents in his 90s. And he was Jewish, and when he first came here, the local power structure didn't want him to practice here. And we're aware of that, but very few other people are. That's a story that gets buried.
Buried, yeah.
And the other thing is, there's a piece of language that remains common here, and I think it remains common across Vermont. I don't know about elsewhere. I have heard people say, at least once a year,
Jew him down.
He Jewed him out of it. He
Jewed
Jewed me down. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And we know what that means.
Yeah.
But most of the people who use the language have forgotten where it came from.
I heard it once last year.
But they have the emotions under there.
So.
And it's a little bit scary when you hit it. And of course, this is the age of Holocaust denial. And
it sounds like that was already, it's happened before too.
Oh,
yes. Yes.
Oh, yeah.
So.
Well, I think, when we see what happens in all different parts of the state. Burlington has its issues, diversity issues with different things. And, I think it's hard. It's hard. Do you hear stories about Jewish problems?
Yeah, and there's a high school kind of near us where they've had problems with certain kids, drawing swastikas and other things around the school. And so they've reached out to say, basically, can you help us deal with this?
Right.
And, it's a little awkward with kind of the people I've talked to who they've reached out to. And I kind of feel like, well, you're the school.
Right.
To, bring us in or something. But they seem to be very, even now, kind of reluctant. They want to deal with it, but they
don't know how to.
They don't know how. And they don't really want, they don't want to deal with it themselves.
Right.
Take the time to learn.
Right.
So it's ongoing.
It's I think New York is this really weird place. It's a privilege, I think. My kids are growing up in public schools in New York, and they have all the Jewish holidays off. They know all of them. They learn about all of them.
Yeah. Right.
And I think it's I don't know if there's any place else like that in the United States. That's that.
Well, the town I grew up in, which is just 10 miles outside of New York City, I just assumed that there were 3 religions, Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish, and that the world was about 1/3 of each, because that's how it was in the town where I was growing up. So it's still stunning to me to realize that Jews make up, is it 0.4% of Americans?
Maybe less.
0.4%.
Well, leave this area and you find out pretty quickly.
Yeah.
That was as I started to study, I would see that. It would one of the first times that I started to before the classes even started to celebrate stuff with you and learn to go through. I remember it was around Passover when we were traveling, and I was like, wait, there's nothing about Passover anywhere. Not on TV, not any decoration, not anywhere.
Yeah.
It's as if it's not happening. I was like, this is bizarre. Yeah. I had no idea, I'd never noticed that before, or the eye for it. But.
Yeah.
It's so interesting to me, though, about when something Jewish does happen, in places where it shouldn't be happening, as an example, when Kiril and Mindy got married, we right away thought of a gift for that Stephen Brownstein. What town is it? Near
Marshfield.
Marshfield. He's the guy who
makes hand-forged
menorahs. He in his shop there, and we said, wouldn't it be neat if we can get them a hand-forged menorah, and it just, what's that place doing in Marshfield, Vermont, and the quirky things of Vermont, as we all embrace, so it's kind of an interesting thing.
Mm-hmm.
If you have students looking for a project, a really fun one would be to go out during the month before Passover or the week or two before and do a survey and find out which towns in Vermont have matzah for sale and which don't.
Yeah, that's also another issue we've had to face, unfortunately. Is originally Price Chopper moved in here.
Jewish owned.
They would have a lot of Passover food, and over the years it's dwindled until there's practically it would be very hard for people to keep Passover with what their offerings are, and it's unfortunate because it makes it all that much harder.
Yeah, I've found the opposite where I live. There's been more and more.
Nice.
Passover food.
Yeah, and the Price Chopper in Burlington carries a unbelievable display. So people have actually call up and they're asking, where can we get this and where can we get that, and it's just that it's very difficult.
Yeah.
Did you get that on Facebook too?
Yeah.
No, I remember I was really surprised and loved it. A friend from high school who I think lives now in rural Idaho or I don't know where she is, was posting. Does anybody know where I can get like Hanukkah candles, and she's like, we used to be one store in town that
Yeah.
carried them.
Yep.
That they don't anymore, and there was this whole like collaborative project to find the nearest place she could go.
Oh,
to
that's
get candles.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, Dave used to, not only did Dave negotiate with the hotels every month or so to make sure there was a good place for Julius and his wife.
Well, we
and especially
negotiated
at the
for a
holidays.
year.
Yeah, and at the holidays.
time.
But he also would be the one who would call Price Chopper and say, now I want to make sure you're stocking things in, and
Yeah.
here are the items that the Jews in the area need. Yeah.
And we tried, we tried for, anyways, it, the grocery stores don't see it as their mission. They see it as their mission of what they're going to sell the most of. And so.
Well, thank you so much.
No, thank you.
I really enjoyed talking to all of you. All right, let's see.
I'm going to give